Welcome to the second part of my conversation with Thammika Songkaeo on Stamford Hospital. In this part, we discuss autofiction and the relationship between writing and the body. If you're enjoying the conversation, please leave us a like and subscribe to the channel. This is the second part of my conversation with Thammika Songkaeo about Stamford Hospital, so welcome back. If you didn't watch or listen to the first part, I do suggest doing so first. Okay, so we covered quite a lot of the sort of basic premise of Stamford Hospital, the context of Singapore. Let's get a little bit more into its kind of literary form. And specifically, I wanted to ask about the fact that you've described Stamford Hospital as a work of autofiction. So I guess a few parts to this question. So firstly, how would you define autofiction, and how do you see the role of autofiction in general, as opposed to, I mean, to me, intuitively, it seems to be between autobiography and fiction. Why not one of those two things? And also more specifically, why is this book written in that way?
Sure. Autofiction to me is a story that derives from the truth or things that truly happened. And it's the writer who stylizes it in a way that they deem fit. I think it's different from an autobiography in that there's more of a prediction of how the form will be. When we talk about an autobiography, I think people expect things to be more factual, at least in form. So I think it's mainly a question of form. For me, it's important to create autofiction as an exercise of self-compassion for the writer. But I think as a society, if we come to expect more autofiction and read more autofiction, I think we can form more open-mindedness about the stories that we allow, and thus the lives that we allow to exist. I personally would love to see a world where empathy was pervasive. Anybody can have lived their life in any way, and we would sit and listen and acknowledge the validity, the depth, the breadth, all of what they've gone through, and ideally would have a world where there was no right or wrong of behavior as much as the question of what made you decide to do that, or how can we feel about that in ways that are actually more positive than negative. And I do believe that that is actually possible, to have the most quote unquote egregious behaviors, and yet the response to that is more positive than negative. So for me, accepting what I wrote as autofiction, even if it's sold in the fiction aisles, reflects my hope that this one story will be received with love, kindness, warmth, and curiosity. And it might start off with a curiosity about my story, but I hope that that curiosity eventually extends to others. And what are the stories of other people? If this is one woman's story that we didn't expect, what can be all the stories out there? So that's my hope with the autofiction bit. And I think that answers your question of what the role of autofiction is. I think it's to request, to demand, to expect empathy, and to ask that, we just want our lives and all that we've gone through to be held. I would give the same to others.
And thank you for that sort of quite powerful answer. It made me think, you're talking about people having the right to tell their stories, people hearing those stories. But onto a sort of practical issue, how easy, difficult was it for you to get this work published? And was the sort of form of, autofiction novel, where does this sit in the bookshop or probably in the online store these days? How difficult was it? How much of the nature of the writing was an issue, and did you sort of have to negotiate it with the publisher?
Yeah. So when I first sold it to the publisher, they didn't know that it was autofiction. And I've
Mm,
never even had an official conversation with them saying it's autofiction. Every time I declare it's autofiction is when I'm out doing things like this, like an interview,
mm,
and then I own that it's autofiction. I think if I had tried to sell it as autofiction, they might have said sell it as a memoir instead. I'm not
mm,
sure, that's a guess. But that reflects more of what we think the publishing industry is ready to accept and sell. Maybe as an industry, the publishing industry doesn't yet have a place where they can run confidently with autofiction.
mm,
But maybe that will change in the future. In terms of the negotiations that I had to do, I think they were more internal with myself
mm,
and with the people involved in this book in real life who are reflected in the book. I think the fact that I first sold it as fiction also speaks for the fear that I had about what would happen if I owned this. But it never sat right with me after it was published to speak about it as fiction. And I think I became confident enough to follow that gut feeling. As if the gut feeling is not to speak about it as purely made up, follow that gut feeling. The consequences will be what they are,
mm.
but the gut feeling exists for a reason. And maybe it is to own what really happened. And if my request for the world is let's have more empathy for each other, then I'm willing to walk that way because I have to do the work of following that gut feeling that asks for that empathy.
Mm. Okay, thank you. Another thought just occurs to me. I mean, we mentioned some of these other terms like biography, autobiography, and memoir. Life writing is a sort of umbrella term that's used now as well. But all that implies you're writing a life. And one thing about Stamford Hospital is it's a very short slice of life. So maybe if it was pitched as memoir, it'd have to sort of start earlier and tell a longer story. Whereas you're able to, with Stamford Hospital, give this really intense kind of hit of a couple of days that is, I think, yeah, very different to you know beginning at the beginning in the sort of building to roman format.
Exactly, exactly.
Um, we were talking about empathy a moment ago, and that happens to lead very nicely onto the next question I had lined up, which is getting towards the end of the book. There's a very interesting line where Teresa she's left the hospital with some mixed feelings about having left her daughter in there with her husband, and she's gone to watch a dance show. It is moving her attention between the different dancers on stage. And she thinks to herself, I'm quoting here, the determinant of their so-called volume, in other words, the volume of the dancers on stage, is in the empathy that I can give them. It seems to me the novel is very much about the effort or the labor involved in giving empathy. Maybe giving empathy shouldn't feel like such hard work, but sometimes it does, I think. And the fact that it's difficult to give as much empathy as we'd like to those around us. Would you agree with that interpretation that the novel is largely about the work of empathy and the difficulty of it? And is this something you were trying to explore?
Yeah. Immediately what comes to mind is balance and what happens to somebody when they're trying to understand and make so much room for others and genuinely do it. They don't really gain anything from it.
Mm,
And what can happen and what can backfire. So in this case, she has to give empathy, or she's trying to give empathy also to her daughter who's in the hospital. But one person she's really trying to give empathy to all the time is her husband for the erectile dysfunction, for the lack of lust that is persistent in his life. And she's trying to tell herself that these things happen because he took a hair loss drug. It is not his fault. It is not his fault. It is not his fault. But we see that this woman needs sex in her life. She is a very sexual creature and it is missing for her. And I think what we come to question in the book is what happens when somebody's needs and so much of their true selves is muted while they're trying to understand and justify the reasons for which they can't get their needs met. And I think what we ultimately learn in the book, and it's really up to everyone's interpretation, but I think one of the possibilities is we ask ourselves, how can empathy lead to better places? Because in this case, it's not very clear that the empathy leads to a better place. It's clear
Mm,
that the empathy leads to actually something like feeling stuck and trapped.
mm,
Um, and I might be contradicting myself when I said earlier, I'd love a world with more empathy, because what we're really talking about right now is, if we do increase our empathy, do we actually land in those situations where we feel stuck? Um, and my gut feeling is that that depends on what is happening in that
mm,
scenario. That depends on whether one's needs are met.
mm,
So to go back to the beginning of my answer, when I said I think what we're wrestling with is an issue of balance. I think one thing the book grapples with is, when does empathy lead to an unbalanced life where you actually suffer more than anything?
mm. Yeah, it seems, a lot of the context, because in the novel there's also the outsourcing of work to maids or helpers, which is we might say, a symptom of the fact that actually giving love and care is never really separate from, the sort of material expectations of that culture, or where one fits in that hierarchy. As we talked about, there's these different sort of compartments in Singapore. So, because of course empathy is a mind, but I think from what you said and from what we see in the story, it has to, or we have sort of internalized this idea, it has to be materialized and look like something for it to count, right? Would you say that's a part of the problem?
Yeah, that's a very good observation, because I do, that phrase empathy is in the mind. I think it goes back to a previous discussion where we're like, well, if the world had more empathy, it would make room for more people.
Mm,
Um, I think when empathy does get materialized, people have to make a choice. Whereas if empathy is just something in the mind, it's not so much a choice as much as just sitting with what somebody else has gone through.
mm,
But when it's materialized is when a choice has actually been made. And one of the things most of us have to figure out when we want to act on empathy is how much of our physical self, our material self, is going to be there and how much of it is going to be absent.
mm,
Um, and in the case of this book, I think we see that the character has tried to make herself absent from her own life,
mm,
while being empathetic about her husband. And for her daughter, it's a bit of the reverse, where she's trying to be there, even if she doesn't really feel comfortable being there the whole time. But it's the reverse. So we see this push and pull when empathy has to be
mm.
materialized or acted upon.
Yeah. And I suppose it's often materialized around particular choices. We talked earlier about this idea of being cosmopolitan and mobile. The big choice, of course, in Stamford Hospital is the decision to remain in Singapore. And there's references to that October when this big decision was made. So, I suppose, we can think of empathy as like a feeling, a state of mind, but at some point, in the reality of life, decisions get made, and then the consequences of those play out for years, right? And this is where I think empathy gets hard, is what seems to be happening in the book, at least. But I think from life experience, I think people might identify with that idea as well.
Yeah, when empathy eventually leads to a road of resentment, right? There is a journey that it can lead.
Yeah.
Uh,
Mm,
yeah,
yeah. And I think that tipping point is so difficult to deal with. Is like, yeah, I've tried to accommodate you. I've tried to accommodate you. Now I want my own space or whatever. Yeah.
you normally don't know until it's too late, until you actually are in the resentment phase, and you're like, I'm in the resentment phase.
Yeah, and at what point was it? Sorry, at what point was the sort of the fork where this became resentment rather than, yeah, yeah,
Exactly.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Mm.
Um, we talked about empathy being materialized. Another question about the sort of the physicality that's present in the novel. Again, towards the end, Teresa goes to a dance class, and you describe her as kind of finding fluidity and flexibility in her body that she hasn't experienced in a long time, and sort of it's contrasted to this rigidity and feeling trapped. Maybe you could talk about that in general, but I was also interested in the fact that, both writing and reading are relatively static, sedentary activities. So my question is, how do you see the relationship between the body, the kind of movement you describe in that dance scene, and the activities of reading and writing, both of which obviously you spend a lot of time doing as well?
Yeah. So I am a dancer in real life. I grew up dancing, love dancing. An interesting fact, maybe to start answering with, is when people practice dance movement therapy, which is not exactly what she does in the book, but my own experience in dance movement therapy taught me that there are actually things we can read from how a person moves. So actually, fluidity, as much as it sounds beautiful and liberating, can actually reflect deep sadness and sorrow.
Mm.
That's not something I knew before I was explained that too, but I was explained the different forms of moving and what can they reflect. So staccato is somebody usually stuck in anger. Fluidity is usually somebody still stuck in sorrow and sadness. When I was writing the book, I did not know that. When I was dancing in the past, I did not know that. The fact that Teresa, the character, usually moves with so much fluidity, and I think nothing but fluidity actually showed, or at least now can be interpreted as her extreme sorrow in life, dancing with that. Now, I think that when somebody moves to express themselves versus when they're sitting and reading and writing, which, as you said correctly, is more of a static activity, I think what we get are actually different flow states, or what we can get, not all the time do we get them, but what we can get is different flow states. The one when you're moving is you get a flow that is wordless, and that is grounding. It is to a good degree liberating. But what usually ends up happening in that state is you don't feel the need to put your experience into words. Whatever the movement was is usually enough. And it's usually so personal that you don't feel the need to tell anybody what it was like. So even if you've got 5 people in a room all moving freely, usually what happens when they come together to debrief, they all just kind of say, that was great.
Mm.
And it's kept personal. I think reading and writing are a bit of the reverse, where physically it's static. But I feel like there's actually liberation movement in the mind in a way that it feels like the mind is expanding wavelengths, words out into the universe. And when I read and write, I actually have a very active mind's eye that feels like a black box. But in that black box, there are so many things moving that I can't capture all of them, but that I allow to move. And even my gestures now reflect that, right? There's like this jellyfish-like movement going on. I think that humans benefit from both having a mind-body connection and sometimes having just a body connection, sometimes having just a mind, even if that dualism is also very, very artificial. But I think that as people, when we need to experience ourselves, we get different data from the two of them. Sometimes they overlap, but sometimes they don't. But it's just so interesting and important, I think, to sit with ourselves in both forms.
Mm. Yeah, that's really interesting. And interesting to hear about you talk about reading and writing as grounded, because yeah, I often think your mind is going so many places when you're reading. That's sort of what reading does. It moves you to those other places. But yeah, at the same time, it's sort of from this one position where you're often, you have your reading spot, your favorite cafe. That's just this sort of safe space, I guess, from where you can go into those things. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a safe space, like you mentioned, right? I've never thought about it that way, but yeah, many people treat their reading spaces as if it's a safe space to begin wandering with the mind.
Yeah.
And writing, safe space to begin wandering with the mind. Yeah. Mm.
I think that's a nice note to finish on, safe spaces for mental wanderings of reading and writing. So thank you so much for coming on, for discussing Stamford Hospital. We'll come back for the third section and hear your recommendations for further reading in just a moment, but thanks for discussing Stamford Hospital.